WVLK AM. We've got Dr. Kevin Cavanaugh with us. He's no stranger to you folks, been coming in here for years. You also read his stuff in the newspaper, in the Lexington Herald-Leader. You set up a great guest for us this morning, and since you did the legwork, I'm going to let you do the honor of introducing our guest.
Well, thank you very much. The guest today is Rosemary Gibson, and I've known her for several years. She is a nationally renowned and award-winning author in patient safety. She's also the editor, or section editor, of the Archives of Internal Medicine, where she has a section called Less is More, which deals with the overuse of medications and tests and procedures. And in addition, she has authored two renowned and award-winning books. One is The Wall of Silence, which essentially deals with when things go wrong, patients aren't told. And the other is The Treatment Trap, which is our desire and craving for medicine and the willingness and eagerness of the medical profession to provide treatment and medicines which aren't necessary.
Interesting.
Yeah. Her newest book out, and it's just been out 2 weeks ago, and which is why I invited her here, is called China RX. And this sheds light on our dependency of mainland China for our medications, and this has both health and national security implications. And I'm very interested in this because just summarize it, and this is from a reader's point of view, but in Kentucky, we unfortunately cook meth on, it seems like, almost every corner. We could figure out how to get opioids and all of these drugs which we do not need, just flooding the market and the black market. But yet, penicillin, it's no longer manufactured in the United States.
Are you kidding?
No, and she will go into this. We have to get this from China with questionable quality controls. So very, very interesting topic. And let me introduce Rosemary, maybe turn over the show to her. And I think it'd be very interesting to know how she fell into this huge topic. This has wide implications.
Rosemary, good morning.
Good morning, Jack. Good morning, Kevin. Nice to talk with you both.
Thank you so much for being with us. This is fascinating. I knew we got a lot of our stuff, including cell phones and everything else, from China, but I didn't know our medicine was coming from there.
Well, when you go to the drugstore and you get one of those amber-colored bottles with a white cap on it, it doesn't say where it comes from.
Oh.
And so this story's been buried, because I think they didn't want us to know.
Huh.
And so I just started looking for a good story and stumbled upon the fact that there's been a big shift in where our medicines are coming from, and now we're importing medicines from China, things like birth control pills and antibiotics and chemotherapies, antidepressants.
How did you get turned on to the story?
Well, you always look for a good story.
Yeah.
And I have a boring life, so I spend a lot of time on the internet looking for a good story. And I saw this report that linked Chinese companies with distributors here in the United States, and started looking at some of the industry trade press. And they were telling it like it is, that we're so dependent on China that if they shut the door, within months, our pharmacies would be empty.
Wow. That's huge.
It is huge.
Is it because of why everything else is made over there, they can do it cheaper?
Well, that's part of it. In the case of penicillin, a number of years ago, back in 2004 and 5, we had a penicillin fermentation plant up in New York. But around that time, and it turns out that China dumped the raw material for penicillin on the world market, just like they do steel. And that just, prices plummeted, and it drove out Western producers, Americans and Europeans and even Indian producers.
Wow.
And so they became the dominant source. And we wrote in the book that after September 11th and the anthrax attacks, the U.S. military went to a European company to buy doxycycline, an antibiotic antidote for anthrax. And I spoke to the CEO of that company. He's a good guy. He says he had to get the starting material from China.
That just blows me away.
It's a stunning story, and it's remarkable that we don't know about it. And it took 3.5 years to figure out what this story is, and it's amazing, Jack. And I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to Dr. Cavanaugh for the chance to tell this story.
And these are prescription medications that your doctor will prescribe for you in this country, and you'll pick them up at your grocery store. I want to differentiate between that and the difference between knowingly ordering medications through the mail from some other country.
Oh, absolutely right. These are authentic prescription drugs.
I'm going to take a break here. Hey, you did another good job there, Kevin. Brought us another great guest. I tell you, the nice thing about knowing Dr. Kavanaugh is he knows everybody. We got a good one here. In case you just joined us, she is the author of a new book. Hadn't been out but a couple of weeks, China RX, Rosemary Gibson. Hey, Rosemary, where can we get China RX?
Jack, China RX is available online on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you walk into a bookstore, you can order it if it's not there on the shelf. And you can also ask your library to get it.
And you were telling me, Kevin, off the air that you think this is going to be big.
Oh, I think it's big. For example, this is just one of the facts that are in the book. And the book is a very easy read, and it surrounds this very compelling story of a patient. So it's not like a textbook. It's a very good read. But in 2011, now this is 2011, so some years ago, so I would imagine things are quite worse than what they were then. 73% of U.S. pharma manufacturers relied on non-U.S. suppliers for at least one component of their product, and nearly 33% had at some point experienced disruption in the supply chain. And you read about this all the time. The hospitals have a shortage of this drug, they have a shortage of that drug. Well, again, the street drugs there never seems to be a shortage of.
Right.
We're flowing over of them. But when you start to having monopolies of single countries controlling manufacturing, you wonder if these shortages aren't an attempt to leverage the market. And cartels are starting to form with these manufacturers. So maybe, Rosemary, you could talk a little bit to this. How secure is our chain of supply?
Well, it's a great question, Kevin. I stumbled upon a U.S. Food and Drug Administration report, and they go in the plants manufactured. Now they do in plants here in the U.S. They always have. We have a really good system here in the U.S., and they've been trying to get into the China plants there since 2012 when they got more resources to do it. So they went into a company in China, and they were so concerned. And they went there because there were consumer complaints, professionals looking at the products. There were particles in some of them. So the FDA went in, and they found what they called systemic data manipulation about the quality and what was really going on with these products. And so the FDA banned 29 of the products from these Chinese companies. But because we're so dependent on China that the FDA had to exempt 14 of those products from its own ban because it was concerned about a shortage. And we're talking here about ingredients for antibiotics and ingredients for chemotherapies. 6 of those products that were exempted from the FDA's ban were products used in chemotherapy, which is for cancer treatment. This is how dependent we are in this country.
All right, hold that thought. I want to take a call. This is Bill. Hey, Bill, thanks for calling.
Hey, good morning. Yeah, this is pretty interesting stuff. I guess I've always been leery about pharmacology and stuff like that as far as when they just have this one miracle pill that's going to help you to get by with, it's like a magic pill. And then that pill has side effects, and then you have to take another pill, and it's a pyramid effect. And I've always thought that was kind of interesting. You may not die or from what your affliction is, but these are harsh chemicals, and they go through your liver and through your kidneys and stuff, and they filter it. And you may not suffer the complications from what you're suffering, but you're going to have liver damage and kidney damage. So,
what do you say to that?
Yeah, this is an additional problem because you do have concern over efficacy and safety of medications as they are approved for their use. I mean, will this drug work? What we're talking about, you may not be getting the drug that you think you're getting, or you may have contaminants in that drug, so that this is a safety issue that's above and beyond what's on the label.
Thank you, Bill. Listen, let me ask you this, Rosemary. When I think about Chinese factories, I think of 6, 8-year-old kids in a sweatshop. Do we have any idea who's making these drugs in China?
The industry in China has vastly improved overall in the past decade. China's aim is to become the pharmacy to the world, and the government is investing billions and billions of dollars in brand spanking new manufacturing plants. So while they're on that trajectory, it takes a while to weed out the bad apples.
Yeah.
And so the FDA goes in, and just recently they went into a plant that was saying it was the manufacturer of a product when in fact it wasn't. It was putting on fake labels. Somebody else was making it, but they put their label on it. And you just can't do that. These are, as the caller said, these are powerful chemicals, and it has to be trustworthy in how you handle them. So China's on the path to become the pharmacy to the world, which is increasing our dependence, which is really problematic. But in the meantime, we lose control. We lose control over our supply of medicines. And the FDA, when they inspect a plant here in the United States, it's very, very thorough. They spend many days. But when doing an inspection in a Chinese plant, it's different. You got language barriers, cultural barriers. It can be very different.
I don't know if this listener is tongue-in-cheek or if he's serious. His name is Kenneth, and he texted, will we have to worry about lead in our meds now?
Well, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, does the best it can to ensure a safe drug supply. But it's very easy, because there's, many people touch the making of a drug. About a decade ago, many Americans died because of contaminated heparin, a blood thinner, widely used in hospitals. And it was deliberately contaminated for economic reasons. It was a cheaper way to make the ingredient. And that was a terrible tragedy. A widely used drug in hospitals and was deliberately contaminated. I think China is trying to up its game because it wants to become the global pharmacy to the world. So that creates another problem of our dependence. It's a national security issue. What happens if we have like a Fukushima type event in China and the whole world is dependent on a single country?
Right.
That's just not smart.
That's scary.
Yeah, the heparin episode was really eye-opening for me, especially on the problems of federal oversight, because as I read the book, the story evolved, and it was suspected that China was then reprocessing this same drug that had been contaminated, but trying to remove most of the contaminants, but there were still traces. And the FDA couldn't prohibit sales because there wasn't another supplier. We're so dependent on heparin. So we were really using a tainted drug, although probably safe. It certainly wouldn't be one that you wanted to use.
Probably safe.
Yeah.
That's a key word there. Probably. We're taking a break. In case you just tuned in, we have a wonderful guest this morning, Rosemary Gibson. She is author of a new book. It's only been out a couple of weeks, called China RX, Exposing the Risk of America's Dependence on China for Medicine. Dr. Kevin Cavanaugh, the founder of Health Watch USA, is in the studio with us, and this is a discussion that Kevin and I were having off the air, Rosemary, is we haven't even gotten into generics. Are we getting a lot of generic prescription meds from China also?
Well, Jack, here's what we're seeing. China's just beginning to ramp up generic drug manufacturing and selling them here in the United States. Where they're really dominant right now and have been for some time is in it's called the active ingredient, the thing that gives a medicine its therapeutic value. That's where it really has global dominance. So a lot of people know that India makes a lot of generic drugs, but even India is dependent on China for the key ingredients to make a lot of the medicines they use and that they sell to us and around the world. So, yeah, we're getting birth control pills, antidepressants, and epilepsy medicine, HIV/AIDS medicine in generic form from China now here in the United States. And it's cheaper, but, you look into it and say, well, if it's made in China, if there's something wrong with the product, can I sue? Well, who do you sue if it's made in China?
Yeah.
If they don't have a facility here, if they don't have any assets here. So the liability issues, it's virtually non-existent. There's no consumer protection in China.
And why is there not a regulation that if meds are coming from anywhere other than the United States, that it not be very clearly labeled that way?
Well, there were efforts about a decade ago to get country of origin labeling, and folks don't want us to know where our products are coming from. That said, in China RX, we have a little section that tells people how they can find out where their medicines are being made.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you can go online, and often the pictures of the packaging will say where it's made. Not always, and if not, then you can call the company and they may tell you.
Now, this is a little different subject, and I'll get back to your book, but what about these medications that are offered on TV and radio, and they come from Canada or Mexico or someplace else like that? That's not even, you don't even know what you're getting in that situation, do you?
Well, there are some cases where many people have gone to reputable pharmacies in Canada to purchase prescription drugs, and those pharmacies monitor their supply chain. That said, the Internet's a very tricky place, and you have to be very, very, very careful where you get your medicines from.
Yeah, there's a lot of counterfeit drugs on the Internet. For example, with this heparin contamination, the amount of contamination varied between the batches and vials tested anywhere from 2% up to 50% of the drug wasn't the drug you ever thought you were getting. So when you buy something off the Internet, you really have little or no recourse if something goes wrong, and you cannot be sure that there is not a huge problem with the drug you're getting because of the big problem of counterfeit drugs. And it's not a small problem. It's real, and there's a lot out there.
Well, what happened with this blood thinner, just to make sure all your listeners know, this is a widely used medicine in hospitals and kidney dialysis centers, and it got into the real supply chain.
Yeah.
This was not from the Internet. This was from the real supply chain, which sent shockwaves.
And the companies were held, at least in a few cases, accountable, the U.S. companies, for not assuring a safe product. But over the Internet, you don't even have that security. One of the other huge problems is just the economics of this. And you could use heparin as an example. The undercutting and lower pricing not only prevents U.S. companies from being able to manufacture a product, but then you start losing the technology and the ability to manufacture in the first place. There's also a heparin substitute, which can be manufactured, sort of a synthetic heparin, that can be used safely. But again, because of the prices and because we're being undercut, that hasn't come to production. And if you get into a trade war with China, that can happen overnight.
Yeah.
Your drugs can drop out, you don't have the supply, and yet it will take years to get a manufacturing plant for a medication up and running.
Here's an email from Tom, Rosemary, asking a question here that I think is a pretty good one. He says, ask your guests, in their opinion, if government got out of healthcare and health insurance, would the free market provide a better and cheaper services for these sectors? Why yes or why no?
Well, I found a memo from the Food and Drug Administration in 1996 when we had the Wild West and Wild East going on, where a wonderful civil servant, he's a chemist, he wrote a memo, and the title was, "We have no idea where these bulk drugs ingredients are coming from, and they could get to the president." What was happening is that companies in the U.S. and elsewhere were buying ingredients, key ingredients, for important medicines from China, and there was virtually no regulation. They didn't go and inspect the plants before buying product from them, and the FDA wasn't going in and inspecting them. We had no idea where the stuff was coming from. So I don't think we want deregulation over our medicines and how they're made. That would be foolhardy, because it would just go down to the bottom of the gutter. We've had really serious problems. You remember when the explosion in Tianjin, China, back like about a year ago, a chemical warehouse exploded? Well, a couple months later, 2 days before Christmas, the FDA sends out an alert that nobody heard about except pharma companies. The FDA was telling its companies that if you bought any products within 18 miles of where that explosion was, you better check it, because they were finding contaminants in our medicines that were coming into the U.S.
And we didn't hear about it.
Right.
Yeah. And I think one thing about the free market, I'm very much a free market supporter, and that works great on local and state levels and even within the nation. But when you start talking about the world economy, and you have a country with 1/3 of the population that is working as a coordinated effort, because they have these cartels, they fix prices, they work as a coordinated effort. It's tough for a company, any one company in the U.S., to compete against that. You need a coordinated effort to combat that. For example, key ingredients for the Hellfire missile fuel only comes from China. You could look at what happened to Disney with the park and the competition they have, and how I think they're going to lose tons of money with that. You could look at other companies that tried to do business with a large coordinated effort, so that if you have a country, you have 1/3 of the world that doesn't grasp principles of free market, and they're doing a coordinated effort to come after some of your industrial sectors, pretty tough to compete that with free market principles of little companies in the U.S., because this is a monster, a behemoth that you're up against.
What kind of economic impact is this having just on jobs in this country?
Oh, Jack, we're in danger of losing whole manufacturing base for medicines. We already have lost a lot. We interviewed a person who runs a manufacturing plant for a brand name drug, and she said all these people are coming to her looking for a job, and they're saying their company's just built a big multi-million-dollar plant, but they shut it down, and they moved manufacturing overseas. So we are in danger of losing our manufacturing capability to make our own medicines.
Yeah, and there have been court cases in the U.S. where the multiple little China companies collude together and fix prices, but yet that's not antitrust because they're all owned by the government of China. See, it's tough to compete.
Yeah, so Jack, we're losing jobs, and we're losing know-how and R&D. American companies are investing billions of dollars in research and development in China for medicines, whereas here, I've talked to many chemists who've lost their jobs.
All right.
We're losing good-paying jobs in this country, and it's also a national security issue.
Yeah. This is John. Good morning, John.
Good morning, yeah. And I'd like to get the author's name again because I'm going to go get that book. I've got 2 points I'd like to see how your research related to it. And one point you just made about the loss of jobs, I'm wondering what effect that had. I've got 2 points. Let me make one. What effect did you find that had on the Puerto Rican economy, which back in the 1980s was a hub of pharmaceutical manufacturing, and now it is a literal wasteland. There's no jobs. The economy has crashed. The island is completely trashed by the hurricane. And how did your research relate to the job loss in Puerto Rico and this problem? And my second question is, actually, I disagree with you about that the FDA is doing a good job. The reason I don't think they are doing a good job is because of what Jack just pointed out about the need for additional rules and regs to address this issue. And secondly, it's very well known that over the last 20 years ago, Big Pharma took control of the FDA from the inside out.
Right.
Just like the deep state is controlling the DOJ and the FBI and the CIA. The same thing happened with Big Pharma, which is big money in the pockets of crooked politicians. So what did you find related to those 2 issues, the FDA and Puerto Rican economy?
Okay, John,
I'll hang up and listen.
I'm going to let you hang up. The name of the author is Rosemary Gibson, and it's China RX. Okay, Rosemary.
Yes, it's a great question. We could talk for hours about it. I'll just say this. The FDA is doing its best in a world where everything has gone global. It's been a domestic agency for all these years, and de facto globalization is a form of de facto deregulation because it'll never be as good when you have to go 10,000 miles away to inspect manufacturing plants. It's just never going to be as good.
Yeah.
And leaders acknowledge that how vulnerable we are. And one of the former FDA commissioners says we have no idea how vulnerable we are. So it's a tough world to operate in. Insofar as job loss, and you're right about Puerto Rico, what's happened particularly with the hurricane, and that triggered shortages of drug products here in the United States. You see the difference with China, though, its government is spending billions and billions of dollars as part of its Made in China 2025 plan. And that's why it's pushing so hard on advanced industries, including pharmaceuticals and medical devices, by the way. If we're not already, it's just a matter of time before our hip and knee implants will also be coming from China, I believe.
Oh, yeah.
They're making MRIs, CT scanners. So what's going to be left of these high-tech industries? And this is why, whatever one's political views are, the proposed tariffs in the current administration in Washington is putting tariffs on those products that relate to advanced industries.
Okay, go ahead. You had a comment.
Yeah, real quick, I think FDA oversight really does need to be strengthened. If you look at the heparin incident, the FDA came up with a test to test for the contaminant, but didn't have the authority to mandate the companies use it, and then didn't have the authority to tell the public which companies used it voluntarily and which companies didn't. And they also didn't have enough port agents to test all the drug coming in through the ports. They only had 94 agents at the time for over 300 ports. The whole thing doesn't add up. So we do need to have the FDA strengthened and some of its ties released so it can effectively do its job.
We're back. We've got Dr. Kevin Cavanaugh in the studio with us, and Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX, is on the phone. And we have a text. Let's see. Let me find it here. We got a couple. This one says, thanks for bringing this important subject to our attention. What can we as individuals do about it, or is it too late? That's from Debbie.
Well, Jack, I think it's a great question, and I think people should be assured that many, many companies and the Food and Drug Administration try their best to ensure that our medicines are safe. I think we need to educate ourselves as not just consumers, but as citizens, and I think the first step in that is letting people know that this is an issue, that this is a problem, because nobody knows. I also believe there are a lot of good people in the industry and in government who know that this is a problem, and we need to create a groundswell to bring drug manufacturing back home and also to diversify the sources of where our medicines are being made. There are a lot of good people who want to see something different because the situation, the path we're on is not good. I predict that within 10 years, who knows what will be left of generic drug manufacturing in the United States, if not less than that.
Should we share those concerns with our Congress people?
Absolutely. Yeah. Tell them about China RX. This book is written in the public interest. It took 3.5 years of research because it's so buried. So the first step is awareness. Let's make ourselves aware, let people know, and we're doing our best to let people in important places know about this situation and say it's just not tenable.
Would you say that most medications, prescription medications, whether they be name brand or generic, most coming out of China are safe or not?
There are a lot of good people that go to work every day to ensure that our medicines are safe, and I would never, ever tell anyone not to take their medicine. Absolutely not. Keep taking your medicine. We have time to fix this problem, and we've got to get on it, and I think there are a lot of good people that do want to see it fixed.
And I should add that when I read the book, this is where I get my knowledge base on this. And of course, I've done additional reading, but by far, this book is the most enlightening text I've ever read on this subject. And there were a number of things that can be done. And there are two big issues. One is assuring the safety of our medicines that are made in China, but the other is not being dependent on China for even safe medicines, because we need to prioritize our medicines that we need and be able to produce ourselves just for national security reasons. We need to have incentives to bring manufacturing home, and we want to make sure that we do not give oversight of quality and safety to China, and we want to strengthen FDA's oversight of these medications and transparency for the public so we can find out what's happening. And those are just some of the solutions that were mentioned in Rosemary's book. And I think one of the biggest testaments to the book is that in the introduction, there's actually a paragraph on the book's importance from Edwin Meese, who's the former U.S. Attorney General, and he points out that our loss of manufacturing capability, the supply of critical medications, that this endangers our medical future and also the welfare of the public, and it's a serious threat to the economy because this is just one of the sectors that this is happening with.
Here's an email that's from Bob that's different. What he says here is Big Pharma and the FDA have to deal with things moving to China, as well as the current wave of legalization of medical marijuana. Will China influence legalization the way Big Pharma has?
That I haven't looked at, but one of the things I do anticipate in about 10 or 20 years, China will ask, and again, this is all projected, but I can imagine China will want to have oversight over its own drug manufacturing and tell the FDA that you don't need to come here, that we're capable of inspecting our own plants for the products that we send to your country, and have what's called a mutual agreement. And this has happened with chicken. You know, we're importing chicken now from China. And the USDA, Department of Agriculture, isn't in those Chinese plants. U.S. consumers are reliant on Chinese inspectors to oversee the quality and safety of the chicken that's being imported into the United States. I worry that in 10, 20 years, that China could do the same thing with our medicines.
We got about a minute left. Before we leave, we want you to tell us once again where we can find your book.
Thank you, Jack. China RX is available online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It's also available in your local bookstore. Call your bookstore, go there and order it, and they can get it. It just came out a week ago. And also ask your public library to buy it so everybody can know about it. And please, please tell your friends and family about this issue. We've got to create a groundswell. We have time to fix it. I'm optimistic that good people want to fix it. We've just got to let everybody know.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you, Kevin.